It was just another typical day at Glenwood High, a school notorious for its rebellious students and the way they treated authority figures. Among the students was a group of bullies, led by the infamous Zach Mitchell, a tall and athletic teenager who always seemed to get away with his pranks. His followers, Mike and Jeremy, weren't any better, eager to join in on whatever trouble Zach stirred up. They found their latest target, Mrs. Eleanor Grant, the kind but strict English teacher. Mrs. Grant had always been respected by those who wanted to learn. Her sharp wit, paired with her no-nonsense attitude, made her both feared and admired. She had a way of commanding the classroom, making students sit up straighter just by glancing at them. However, there were a few students who believed they could test her authority, and they often did. It was a typical Friday afternoon, and the classroom buzzed with the low hum of chatter. Mrs. Grant stood at the front of the room, writing notes on the board as the students scrambled to copy them. But Zach, Mike, and Jeremy had something else in mind. They had been planning for days. Today, they were going to embarrass her. As she turned to face the class, Mrs. Grant felt an unsettling silence fall over the room. She didn't notice the trio huddling near the back, conspiring. The bell had just rung, and the students were eager to leave, but the bullies had one last trick up their sleeves. They were going to try and lift Mrs. Grant's skirt as a way to humiliate her in front of the class. It was a petty, childish prank, but they were certain it would work. Zach had positioned himself just behind Mrs. Grant, waiting for the perfect moment. He glanced at Mike and Jeremy, who were ready to burst into laughter at what they thought would be a victory over their teacher. With one swift motion, Zach reached for her skirt, just as Mrs. Grant turned around, her face as calm as ever, but her eyes narrowed as she caught the movement. The class held its breath. Zach's hand froze midair as he realized the teacher had caught him in the act. There was no embarrassment in her expression, no sign of fear. Instead, Mrs. Grant's gaze remained steady and composed. Without missing a beat, she took a small step forward and raised her voice, making sure every student in the room could hear. "Mr. Mitchell, I see you're eager to learn something today. Well, I have a lesson for you." The room fell silent, and the bullies' smug expressions began to falter. Zach wasn't sure what to expect, but he certainly didn't think she would take control of the situation with such confidence. The other students in the class exchanged nervous glances. Some of them had heard rumors about Mrs. Grant's quick wit and sharp tongue, but no one had ever seen her respond to a prank quite like this. Zach, who was used to being the one in control, felt his confidence slipping. The adrenaline that had once rushed through him now gave way to uncertainty. Mrs. Grant took another step toward Zach, her eyes never leaving his. She crossed her arms over her chest, a slight smile tugging at the corners of her lips, as if she had expected this moment. "I must admit, I've never had a student attempt such a childish stunt," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But perhaps you're not aware of the lesson we'll be learning today. You see, in this classroom, respect is the first lesson, and it is one that apparently you and your friends have yet to learn." The words hung in the air, and the other students, sensing the tension, stayed absolutely still. They had witnessed Zach's pranks before, but this time was different. Mrs. Grant wasn't flustered, and she wasn't going to let him get away with it. Instead, she was about to make sure Zach would regret the prank in a way that he would never forget. Zach's face flushed. For the first time, he felt a pang of doubt. He had always prided himself on being able to get away with anything, especially at Glenwood High. Teachers, for the most part, either turned a blind eye or lacked the resolve to stop him. But this was Mrs. Grant, a teacher with a reputation for demanding excellence and respect. And now he had gone too far. "Mr. Mitchell," Mrs. Grant said, her voice steady but her eyes sharp, "you will learn what true discipline means, and it will not be through the game you wanted to play today." Zach opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He wanted to argue to defend himself, but the calm authority in Mrs. Grant's voice made him hesitate. His friends, Mike and Jeremy, stood awkwardly in the back, sensing that this wasn't going to be like the other pranks they had pulled off. Mrs. Grant turned her attention to the rest of the class. Everyone, I hope you've learned an important lesson today about respecting the people who are here to teach you. Zach and his friends thought it would be funny to undermine my authority, but it's not about me, it's about respect for each other. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Then, with a small but knowing smile, she added, I think we've all had enough fun for one day, wouldn't you agree? Zach's face reddened even more, and he looked down at the floor, avoiding her gaze. He couldn't meet her eyes. For once, he felt small, humbled, and completely out of control. Mrs. Grant turned back to the front of the classroom. All right, class, we have work to do. I want you all to open your books to Chapter 8. Mr. Mitchell, if you'd like, you can join the rest of us in learning something today. Her tone was sarcastic, but laced with a quiet challenge. Zach knew that his days of getting away with such pranks were over. He had underestimated Mrs. Grant, and now he was paying the price. But the worst part? It wasn't the embarrassment. It wasn't the fact that the entire class had witnessed his failed attempt at humiliation. No, the worst part was the quiet understanding in Mrs. Grant's eyes. She had already won, without needing to raise her voice or show anger. And for Zach, that was the most humiliating thing of all. The bell rang, and students began to pack their bags, some of them casting sidelong glances at Zach. The bullies had tried to break Mrs. Grant, but it was they who had been broken. As the students filed out of the classroom, Zach stayed seated for a moment longer than anyone else. His mind raced, but he couldn't shake the realization that Mrs. Grant had taught him something far more valuable than any prank could ever teach him. Zach's reputation, his confidence, and his pride were all in tatters. Mrs. Grant hadn't just outsmarted him. She had stripped away the facade of invincibility that Zach had carefully crafted. As the last student left the room, Mrs. Grant gave Zach one last look, her expression unreadable but knowing. She had made her point. The lesson had been taught, and Zach, the so-called king of pranks, had learned his lesson the hard way. Zach, Mike, and Jeremy exchanged nervous glances, feeling a sense of unease settle over them. They had expected Mrs. Grant to break down, maybe even cry, and give them the satisfaction of seeing their teacher falter under their prank. Instead, they were met with something they hadn't anticipated at all. Mrs. Grant stood there, unshaken, her composure intact. The once smug faces of the bullies were now masked with uncertainty. There was no fear in her eyes, only the calm, calculating gaze of someone who had already won the battle. The class was silent, waiting to see what would happen next. Zach could feel his palms sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never seen Mrs. Grant so poised, so in control. It was as if she had been expecting this moment all along, and the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had underestimated her. He had expected a simple emotional reaction, but instead, she was about to show them just how clever she was. Mrs. Grant finally broke the silence, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had seen through their petty prank and was about to teach them a lesson they would never forget. The kind of smile a seasoned chess player gives after they've anticipated every move their opponent will make. Since you're so curious about my skirt, how about I teach you a lesson on respect? She said, her voice steady and commanding. Her eyes flickered over to Zach, who had the audacity to make eye contact, his face flushed with shame. You see, Zach, you seem to be in need of some consequences for your behavior. Zach swallowed hard. The others were looking at him, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. The words Mrs. Grant was about to say would change everything. Her gaze swept across the room, and the tension in the air thickened. The class could feel that something was coming, something bigger than they had expected. They had all seen the bullies pull pranks before, but this time it was different. Mrs. Grant wasn't angry. She was methodical, calculated, and her revenge was about to unfold in a way that none of them could predict. Your punishment, Mrs. Grant continued, will come in the form of a little experiment. She paused, letting the words sink in. You three are going to present to the class tomorrow, but here's the twist. You'll each be presenting on something you know absolutely nothing about. I'll assign each of you a difficult book to read, one that will test your knowledge, patience, and ability to stay composed. Mike's face dropped, and Jeremy let out a small groan. Zach could feel the weight of the situation sinking in. They had expected a punishment that would be over in minutes, something that would make the class laugh. But now, they had just become the subjects of a lesson far beyond anything they could have imagined. Zach tried to swallow the lump in his throat. He wasn't prepared for this. He was always the one in control, the one making others feel small, not the one who would be subjected to ridicule. And yet here he was, the recipient of a punishment that promised far more embarrassment than anything he had ever dished out. But Mrs. Grant wasn't done. You won't just be standing there reading aloud, she added with a gleam in her eye. I'll be testing you, too. If you fumble even once, you will be graded accordingly. The rest of the class will participate, asking questions and evaluating your performance. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper, but it carried to every corner of the room. You will fail in front of everyone. A quiet ripple of disbelief passed through the students. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. Zach, Mike, and Jeremy had tried to humiliate Mrs. Grant, but now they were the ones being set up for a very public, very humiliating failure. They had thought they could get away with anything, but Mrs. Grant had just flipped the tables on them in a way they couldn't have predicted. As the bell rang and the class filed out, the three bullies remained seated still in shock. They had come into the day expecting to have a laugh at their teacher's expense, but now they were left to face the consequences of their own actions. The weight of the upcoming challenge felt like a mountain pressing down on them. The next morning, the trio arrived at school early, each of them clutching the books Mrs. Grant had assigned them. The thick volumes looked intimidating, their covers filled with foreign terminology, technical jargon, and complicated illustrations. Zach couldn't make sense of half of what he saw. These weren't the light, easy reads he had expected. These were serious academic texts, books that required real intellectual engagement. Mike and Jeremy exchanged nervous glances as they walked into the classroom. The other students were already seated, some whispering excitedly about the punishment that had been doled out. The sense of anticipation was palpable, and Zach could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. Mrs. Grant was standing at the front, a calm smile on her face, her demeanor suggesting that she had been preparing for this moment for weeks. "Good morning, gentlemen," Mrs. Grant greeted them as they approached the front of the room. "I trust you've all had a chance to familiarize yourselves with your assignments?" The three bullies nodded, but there was no confidence in their movements. They had barely skimmed the pages, hoping to get through it without really understanding the content. They knew that presenting without knowledge would be their downfall, but there was nothing they could do now. They were trapped. One by one, each of them began their presentation, but it didn't take long for the cracks to show. Zach started with the first chapter of his book, but his words faltered. He stuttered over unfamiliar terms, mispronounced scientific names, and fumbled through his notes. His confidence, which had always been so easy to maintain, was gone. The class watched in silence, some of them exchanging glances, while others tried to stifle their laughter. Mike wasn't any better. He tried to read from his book, but he couldn't follow the complex concepts laid out in front of him. Every attempt to explain a point was met with more confusion, both from him and from his classmates. Jeremy, the third in line, wasn't much different. His voice wavered as he stumbled over basic definitions, his eyes darting from his book to Mrs. Grant, hoping for some kind of mercy. But Mrs. Grant wasn't there to offer mercy. She sat at her desk, watching them closely, her eyes sharp and focused. Every mistake, every fumble, was an opportunity to teach them a lesson in humility. When they couldn't answer her questions, she would simply ask for more details, digging deeper until they were forced to admit that they didn't know anything about the subject at all. By the time the last of the bullies had finished his presentation, the mood in the classroom had shifted entirely. Zach, Mike, and Jeremy were no longer the tough, untouchable kids they once were. They were the subjects of a cruel lesson, and their classmates saw it all unfold. Mrs. Grant had turned the tables on them, and the humiliation they had tried to inflict on her now rested squarely on their shoulders. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the class, Mrs. Grant stood up. The three bullies were left in the front of the room, red-faced and defeated, while the rest of the class filed out, some of them whispering to each other about what they had just witnessed. Mrs. Grant smiled to herself, knowing that she had not only humiliated them, but had also imparted a lesson they would never forget. Zach, Mike, and Jeremy would walk away from that day with their pride shattered. They had tried to break their teacher, but instead, they had lifted the veil on their own ignorance. And Mrs. Grant had done it all with a calm smile and the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had outsmarted them at their own game. As the bullies walked out of the classroom, their heads hung low. They couldn't escape the powerful lesson they had just learned. Mrs. Grant had shown them that true power didn't come from humiliation or pranks. It came from intellect, composure, and the ability to turn the tables when least expected. Zach, Mike, and Jeremy would remember this day for the rest of their lives. What lesson do you think they learned? Do you think they'll ever pull another prank again? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon for more dramatic tales like this one. Stay tuned for more incredible stories that will leave you amazed and inspired. This is Expect Stories, where real-life drama meets unforgettable twists.